The morning mist rolled off the French coast as thousands of weary British soldiers stumbled through the ruins of Dunkirk. The sound of artillery echoed in the distance, dull thuds that made the ground tremble beneath their boots. It was May 26, 1940. 3 weeks earlier, Britain and France had stood together against Hitler's unstoppable advance. Now that alliance lay shattered. The German blitzkrieg had torn through the Low Countries like a storm. France was collapsing. Belgium had fallen. And the entire British Expeditionary Force, nearly 400,000 men, was cornered against the sea. The beaches of Dunkirk stretched for miles, a vast open plain of sand and despair. There was nowhere left to retreat, no stronghold to defend. The enemy surrounded them on all sides, their tanks pressing closer every hour. Above them, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe, their bombers circling like vultures. To those trapped soldiers, Dunkirk wasn't just a beach, it was the end of the line. They had fought hard and bravely, but now defeat was certain. The sea lay before them, gray and cold, a silent witness to their fate. Yet, in that moment of utter hopelessness, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A story that would defy military logic and rewrite the meaning of courage. This was not just the story of a retreat. It was the story of ordinary people who refused to let their sons and brothers die alone. In London, the news from France hit like a thunderclap. Reports poured into the War Office, encircled units, destroyed supply lines, soldiers fleeing under fire. Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood in the underground command room, staring at a map filled with red pins pushing ever closer to the coast. The French front had collapsed. Calais had fallen. Dunkirk was next. There were only 2 choices left: surrender or attempt an evacuation so massive it bordered on madness. The Royal Navy had ships, destroyers, minesweepers, cargo vessels, but nowhere near enough to move hundreds of thousands of men. The beaches were too shallow for large ships to dock, and the port itself was being shelled to pieces. Churchill's generals told him plainly, perhaps 30,000 could be saved. The rest would be lost. But Churchill was not a man to surrender to numbers. "We shall never give in," he muttered almost to himself. Then, louder, "We will bring our army home." In that moment, Operation Dynamo was born. A desperate plan to rescue an entire army using whatever could float. Deep inside the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, naval officers began to coordinate what would become the greatest evacuation in military history. Little did they know their plan would depend not only on destroyers and warships, but on fishermen, ferrymen, and ordinary men and women whose courage would soon eclipse that of generals. By the time the first orders were sent, Dunkirk had become a nightmare. Columns of soldiers trudged through the dunes toward the beaches, weapons slung low, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The tide came and went, carrying with it the bodies of the fallen. The sand was littered with helmets, rifles, and shattered hope. From above, the Luftwaffe owned the skies. Every few hours, the wail of Stuka dive bombers would pierce the air. Soldiers would throw themselves flat as bombs exploded around them, sending geysers of sand and seawater high into the air. Some never got up again. Yet, through the chaos, order somehow endured. The British soldiers formed long, silent queues that stretched into the surf. Thousands standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting their turn, knowing that each passing minute could be their last. At night, the horizon glowed orange as Dunkirk burned. The once proud port city was now an inferno. The crackle of flames mixed with the cries of the wounded. But amidst the horror, a strange calm settled in. They were soldiers, trained to wait, to obey, even in the face of death. None could see the distant coast of England beyond the mist. Yet all of them prayed that someone, anyone, might come. Across the Channel, in England's southern harbors, word began to spread. The Navy needed help. Every seaworthy vessel, no matter how small. Posters went up in seaside towns. Radio bulletins urged boat owners to report to their local ports. But in truth, it wasn't the orders that moved them. It was the understanding that the men stranded at Dunkirk were their own. Sons, brothers, friends, the heart of Britain, trapped and waiting. From the docks of Ramsgate, Dover, and Folkestone, a quiet miracle began. Fishermen checked their nets one last time, then packed flares and blankets. Retired sailors polished brass fittings that hadn't shone in years. Owners of pleasure yachts and ferries arrived uninvited, volunteering their vessels for service. They didn't ask who would command them. They didn't ask if it was safe. They simply said, "Where do we go?" Naval officers stood astonished as boats arrived by the dozens. Sailboats, lifeboats, tugboats, even tiny river barges. They called them the little ships of Dunkirk, though none yet understood what that name would come to mean. As one naval commander wrote later, it was as if the sea itself had summoned them. The first civilian boats left England before dawn. The sea was calm, but the air carried the faint rumble of war from across the channel. Each vessel was packed with jerrycans of fuel, ropes, and hastily drawn maps. Many captains had never navigated those waters before. They had no guns, no armor, only courage and faith. As they approached the French coast, smoke from Dunkirk darkened the horizon. The air was thick with ash. Bombs thundered in the distance. Some boats turned back. Others pressed on. They knew the risks. One hit from above and they'd vanish in an instant. But they kept going. When the first of the little ships appeared off the beaches, soldiers could hardly believe their eyes. Tiny fishing boats, yachts, and ferries dotted the horizon like a fleet from another world. One soldier later recalled, "We thought they'd come for the officers. We never imagined they'd come for all of us." It was then that hope returned. The rescue was chaos wrapped in courage. Bombs fell constantly. The Luftwaffe targeted anything that moved. Destroyers, barges, even tiny fishing boats. Smoke and seawater mixed into choking clouds. Yet the evacuation never stopped. Men waded chest-deep through the surf to reach the boats. Some swam. Others linked arms and carried the wounded. Small boats ferried soldiers from the beaches to larger naval ships waiting offshore. When one was destroyed, another took its place. In one of history's most extraordinary displays of determination, civilians, many with no combat training at all, faced machine gun fire and shrapnel to pull strangers aboard their decks. The sea became a living bridge between two worlds, one of despair, one of defiance. And through it all, the British spirit refused to die. "We had no uniforms, no ranks, no orders," remembered one skipper. "Just a shared understanding. They needed us, and we would not fail." By the third day, the evacuation had turned into a monumental effort of coordination. Royal Navy ships formed lines offshore while the smaller vessels moved back and forth, hour after hour. Some carried 50 men, others barely 10. But together they achieved the impossible. The beaches, once a symbol of doom, were now alive with movement. Soldiers cheered as boats appeared through the smoke. Officers shouted instructions organizing loading zones. In the chaos, discipline and kindness found each other again. Soldiers helped wounded comrades first, then climbed aboard themselves. Civilians handed out tea, water, and biscuits to men shaking from exhaustion. For many rescued that week, the faces of those civilian skippers remained etched in memory forever. They looked nothing like heroes, one private recalled. Just ordinary men, sunburned, tired, determined. But when I saw them, I knew we weren't finished yet. Day after day, the armada grew. More vessels joined the crossing. Ferries, lifeboats, even private sailboats. The sea was crowded with courage. Every return trip brought hundreds more to safety. At times, the horizon shimmered with so many small craft that it seemed England itself was moving toward France. By June 1st, the number of rescued men had passed 200,000. The beaches were still under fire, but the miracle could no longer be denied. Even the Germans paused in disbelief at the sight. A civilian fleet defying their empire. In the words of one pilot who flew cover above the beaches, "Down there was not just an army being saved. It was a nation finding its soul." The nights at Dunkirk were endless. Soldiers huddled in shallow trenches along the dunes, listening to the distant drone of enemy aircraft. Fires flickered across the horizon as ships burned offshore, their silhouettes glowing briefly before vanishing into the Black Sea. Men whispered prayers, clutching rosaries, photographs, or letters from home. Some wrote farewell notes, leaving them behind in the sand. Out at sea, the small boats kept moving, their engines coughing through the dark. Many had no navigation lights. To use them would invite a bombing run. The skippers steered by moonlight, by instinct, and by sheer will. Some towed lifeboats filled with wounded men. Others drifted silently to avoid detection, praying the tide would carry them home. Every crossing was a gamble with death. Some vessels disappeared without a trace, struck by bombs or caught in the crossfire. But every man rescued, every boat that made it back, strengthened the resolve of those still waiting. The Dunkirk beaches were no longer just a battlefield. They had become the heartbeat of a nation refusing to die. To the soldiers on the beach, it seemed the Royal Air Force was nowhere to be found. "Where is the RAF?" They shouted as German planes screamed overhead. What they didn't know was that, high above the clouds, British pilots were fighting for their lives. From bases in southern England, waves of Spitfires and Hurricanes were sent across the channel to duel the Luftwaffe. They couldn't linger. Every minute of fuel counted. But in those brief, violent skirmishes, they shot down dozens of enemy aircraft, buying the men below precious hours of survival. Pilot officer Alan Deere later recalled, "It was chaos in the skies, bombers diving, tracers everywhere, the sea below a sheet of fire. Many didn't return. Yet their sacrifice went unseen by those on the ground who thought they'd been abandoned. In truth, the RAF was their unseen guardian, fighting an air war so ferocious that few who engaged in it lived to tell the tale." By May 30th, the beaches of Dunkirk were a living organism. Chaos, movement, and unyielding determination intertwined. Lines of men stretched far into the shallows, their uniforms soaked, rifles rusting in the salt air. Officers used megaphones to direct loading. Destroyers came close to shore, their decks packed shoulder to shoulder with soldiers. Smaller craft dashed between them, ferrying the next wave. On one such run, the fishing trawler Tamzine, barely 15 feet long, carried dozens of men at a time. Her skipper, a quiet fisherman from Margate, refused to turn back even as shrapnel tore through her hull. "She'll hold," he muttered, bailing water with a tin can. And she did. Every inch of that operation was improvised. Rope ladders hung from ship sides, and men climbed aboard barefoot, shaking, their faces black with soot. Some wept openly as they saw the Union Jack painted on the destroyers. They were safe. For now. The German High Command, furious at the continued evacuation, unleashed every weapon it had. Artillery batteries along the French coast shelled the waters near Dunkirk. Submarines prowled offshore. The Luftwaffe intensified its bombing, striking day and night. Yet the Armada would not stop. At sea, naval gunners fired at the incoming planes, while small civilian boats zigzagged to avoid strafing runs. Smoke screens were laid to conceal the evacuation lanes. The sea itself seemed to rebel. Oil slicks caught fire, lifeboats drifted amid wreckage. Still, more men were lifted off the beaches. By now, the miracle had become unstoppable. For every ship that sank, 2 more appeared. Britain's coastlines were emptying of boats, but filling with hope. Dunkirk, once the symbol of disaster, was fast becoming a legend in motion. Amid the British withdrawal, thousands of French soldiers remained behind, holding a crumbling defensive line against the German advance. They knew they would not be rescued. Their mission was simple: buy time. They fought in the ruins of Dunkirk's outskirts, street by street, building by building. General Fagalde and his men, surrounded and outnumbered, refused to surrender. Their stand allowed thousands of British troops to reach the evacuation points. When the last British ship pulled away, French soldiers were still firing from the docks, their rifles glowing red-hot. One British officer, safe aboard a destroyer, watched the flames consume the city and whispered, "They are buying our freedom with their lives." The French garrison held out until June 4th, when the last resistance finally fell. Their courage was the quiet pillar that made the miracle possible. Amid the chaos, a quieter kind of heroism unfolded. Hospital ships, painted white with red crosses, crossed into the war zone again and again, despite being prime targets. They carried the broken, the burned, and the blind, men who had seen too much. One of them, the SS Paris, made repeated crossings under constant air attack. Nurses tended to wounded soldiers as bombs fell nearby, the decks trembling with each blast. They had no weapons, only bandages and courage. A young nurse later wrote in her diary, "We worked in the glow of burning ships. Every face we bandaged, we did not know if he would live. But every heartbeat was worth the risk. Their mission was mercy amid madness, the part of war that history too often forgets." By June 2nd, the weather began to turn. Heavy winds and rain swept across the channel, threatening to end the evacuation. The waves grew taller, the visibility worse. Yet even nature seemed to take sides. The rough seas grounded the Luftwaffe's smaller aircraft, giving the rescuers a precious reprieve. Civilian skippers fought the waves with the same stubbornness they'd shown against the bombs. Many were soaked to the bone, hands blistered from hours at the wheel. Yet they refused to turn back. The sea had become their battlefield, and their ally. That night, the final convoys left Dunkirk, packed beyond capacity. In the darkness, ships collided, engines failed, but the will to continue never faltered. One naval officer later said, "I've seen bravery in battle, but never like that. Men against the sea, men against fate." By the morning of June 4th, only the last defensive troops remained, British rearguards and French fighters covering the withdrawal. Smoke blanketed the shoreline. The air reeked of oil and death. Yet, amid the ruins, small boats still appeared through the haze, searching for survivors. At 3:30 a.m., the final British soldiers boarded the last departing destroyers. The beaches that had once held hundreds of thousands were now empty, silent except for the waves washing over abandoned helmets and rifles. Behind them, German tanks rolled into Dunkirk. The evacuation was over. In 9 days, 338,000 men had been rescued, far more than anyone dared to believe. It was not victory, but it was survival. And survival, at that moment, was enough to keep hope alive. When the ships reached English shores, crowds waited on the docks. Mothers, fathers, and children straining for a glimpse of familiar faces. The rescued soldiers stumbled ashore, sunburned, exhausted, many too weak to speak. Women handed them tea, blankets, and cigarettes. Some wept openly. Churchill visited Dover to watch the men disembark. He said nothing at first, only watched as the weary soldiers passed by. Finally, he turned to an aide and said softly, "Wars are not won by evacuations, but this is deliverance." The soldiers who had escaped Dunkirk were not triumphant heroes. They were survivors, humbled, haunted, but alive. And behind them stood the courage of thousands of ordinary citizens who had crossed into hell and brought them home. As the last ships vanished over the horizon, Dunkirk was left in ruins. The beaches were littered with wrecked vehicles, shattered rifles, and unburied dead. The tide washed over helmets and gas masks, pulling fragments of war out to sea. Those who remained behind, French soldiers too wounded to move, British medics who refused to abandon their patients, were captured. The Germans marched them through the ruins, past the smoldering fuel dumps, past the place where the miracle had happened. For the survivors in Britain, Dunkirk was not easily forgotten. Many carried what they called the Dunkirk stare, a hollow look that never left their eyes. They had seen friends drowned, burned, or crushed under retreating trucks. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else: gratitude. Against all odds, they were alive. On June 4, 1940, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons to deliver one of history's most powerful speeches. The air was thick with tension. Britain was alone. France was collapsing. The entire world expected surrender. But Churchill's words ignited something deep within the British soul. "We shall go on to the end," he declared. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air." Members of Parliament sat in stunned silence. Some wept. Others banged their fists on the benches in approval. Churchill didn't call Dunkirk a victory. He called it a deliverance, a sign that Britain still had the courage to endure. His voice transformed despair into defiance. From that day, surrender was no longer an option. Across Britain, the little ships of Dunkirk became legends overnight. Their names were printed in newspapers and spoken with reverence in pubs, churches, and classrooms. Each had a story of bravery, sacrifice, and ordinary heroism. The Sundowner, once a pleasure yacht, ferried 130 men in a single trip. The Medway Queen, a paddle steamer, rescued over 7,000 troops. Even fishing boats and lifeboats became symbols of salvation. Many were damaged beyond repair, yet their owners refused compensation. "We'd do it again," they said simply. The Ministry of Information released photographs of the small vessels returning home, flags fluttering, decks crowded with weary soldiers. The sight stirred something deep in the British people. It wasn't just a fleet. It was a floating reminder that courage was not limited to uniforms or ranks. It was something that lived in the hearts of ordinary citizens. For those rescued, the battle didn't end at Dunkirk. Back in England, hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Men woke screaming in the night, reliving the terror of bombings and sinking ships. Some were haunted by guilt. Why had they survived when their comrades hadn't? The British government issued simple uniforms labeled "Returned from Dunkirk," so the public would recognize them and offer support. Civilians handed them cigarettes, food, and letters of thanks. But no one truly understood what those men had endured. Many soldiers described feeling both relief and shame. Relief for being home, shame for leaving France behind. But gradually, as the stories spread and the public's admiration grew, that shame transformed into something else: pride. They began to understand that their survival wasn't a sign of weakness. It was proof that Britain still had a chance to fight again. News of the Dunkirk evacuation spread rapidly across the globe. In America, newspapers carried headlines like "Miracle at Dunkirk" and "British Spirit Unbroken." President Franklin Roosevelt called it a testament to the courage of a free people. The images of small civilian boats ferrying soldiers through smoke and fire captured the imagination of millions. For the first time, the world saw Britain not as a crumbling empire, but as a nation standing alone against tyranny. Defiant, resilient, unyielding, even neutral countries watched in awe. Dunkirk became a moral victory, a symbol of human endurance. And in Berlin, the German High Command, though triumphant, could not ignore what they had just witnessed. They had expected total annihilation. Instead, they had allowed a miracle. Dunkirk did more than save an army. It saved a nation's spirit. Within weeks, new recruitment drives swelled the ranks. Aircraft factories doubled production. Ordinary citizens, men, women, and even children, joined civil defense units, building air raid shelters, planting victory gardens, and preparing for invasion. The phrase "Dunkirk Spirit" entered the national vocabulary, a shorthand for courage under fire, for standing together when all seems lost. It wasn't about glory. It was about endurance. When the Blitz began later that year, the people of London, Coventry, and Liverpool faced the bombs with that same spirit. They remembered the men on the beaches, the little boats in the surf, and the quiet defiance that turned retreat into resolve. Dunkirk had not ended the war, but it had proved that Britain would never give up. Decades later, many of the men who took part in the evacuation rarely spoke of it. Fishermen returned to their harbors. Shopkeepers reopened their stores. Soldiers went on to fight in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Yet beneath their quiet lives lay a shared memory of those 9 days in 1940, when ordinary people did something extraordinary. The boats that survived were preserved in museums, or lovingly maintained by veterans' families. Every year they sail again across the Channel in commemoration, not as warships, but as symbols of peace, courage, and unity. For the younger generations, Dunkirk became a lesson in what it means to stand together. It reminded the world that even in the darkest hour, courage can come from the most unexpected places, from fishermen, teachers, fathers, and sons who refused to let their country die. In the end, Dunkirk was not just a military operation. It was a miracle of humanity. It showed that war, though cruel and senseless, cannot extinguish compassion. When the call came, thousands answered, not for medals or orders, but because it was the right thing to do. Historians still debate the reasons behind the German halt order, the strategies, the luck involved. But to those who were there, none of that mattered. What mattered were the hands that reached out through the smoke, the strangers who risked their lives for others, the bond that united an island in its darkest hour. When Churchill called it a deliverance, he was right, for in those 9 days at Dunkirk, Britain rediscovered its soul, and the world learned that even in retreat there can be victory, when courage, compassion, and unity sail together against the tide.